So grateful as we have worked so mightily with the worship planning group throughout this month to stick with Joseph through the hard times and the more hard times in order to arrive at moments in which there are promising hope that exists not only for his family, but for those who are in deep search and need of food. And so it was in this spirit of forgiveness that I was thinking that Bob was bringing his sunflowers this morning. And I was remembering that his long rows of sunflowers that are out in front of his house, out a stretch from here, up north off 95. I remember that we would have these beautiful, brilliant, bright images of new life that were springing among us. And it brought to mind a story that many of you may know, but that we might remember together. There is a book by Simon Wiesenthal called The Sunflower, and it was published originally in 1969, and there have been multiple iterations since, in part because it is so thought-provoking, and in part because they continue to add people who share their own responses to this text. It recounts Simon Wiesenthal's experience as a Jew during World War II. He was serving in a concentration camp. And one day, a group of his fellow prisoners were taken to a job cleaning waste at a field hospital on the Eastern Front. On the way there, they passed a cemetery for German soldiers, and he sees that there has been a sunflower planted at each grave. A pang arises within him. Even in death, these are offered something of life, that the butterflies might fly above their remains. Simon thought then of his own death that he felt would be impending, and the inmates that he would be alongside in a mass grave. He wrote, "No sunflower would ever bring light into my darkness, and no butterflies would dance above my dreadful tomb." While working at that hospital, Simon is approached, and he's taken to the bedside of a German soldier. This soldier, badly injured with bandages all over his face, just his eyes able to look out barely, had reached out to the nurse and asked if there was any Jews there on the campus, any Jew that he might talk to. His dying wish was, "Please bring me a Jew." It was Simon who was found in the midst of his cleaning and taken from that job in order to sit at the bedside of this soldier, Carl. Carl wanted to share from his heart. And so Simon settled in there. Carl proceeds to tell his story. An only child born to Christian parents. His parents were not supporters of the Nazis, but he found himself drawn into the Nazi youth with a sense of belonging, and then became an SS soldier, part of the infamous protection squad of the Nazi army. He proceeded to tell horrific stories about what he had been a part of, including the mass killing of Jews in a Ukrainian town, and then specifically the shooting of a young boy. Time passed during which Simon never spoke. Carl asked at one point for Simon to hold his hand, and Simon held his hand. Did he have a choice? Simon noticed that there was a sunflower that had been placed as a sign of comfort in the soldier's window. After a stretch of time in which we can imagine all kinds of emotions flooding both for the soldier and for Simon, Carl came to finally say, "I know what I told you is terrible," and then asked for forgiveness, indicating that he sought to die in peace. At which point, Simon, who had never spoken, let go of the soldier's hand, stood up, and left in silence. Carl Seidel died overnight, and he wanted to leave his possessions, all he had in the world, to Simon. But Simon refused and said they should be sent to his family. Simon did live through the war and time in 4 concentration camps, but 89 members of his family did not. At the end of his writing, many years after he had come from that time. Simon asked the reader and asks us the impossible question, ought I have forgiven him? Simon did not speak in those last moments with Carl, but he spent a lifetime seeking to track down Nazis to be tried. And he spent a lifetime hearing from all kinds of people trying to answer this question, ought I have forgiven him? Originally in this book, there were 10 responses. In the modern day iteration of this book, there are 53 responses from leaders, leading thinkers, philosophers, and theologians who are grappling with this question. Among the respondents were fellow Holocaust survivors and survivors of other genocides around this world. Even one Nazi soldier offered his response. Some of those have, like Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who walked alongside the tragedy of mass violence and killing in South Africa, wrote their response. Tutu has written prolifically about forgiveness, and in his own book, The Book of Forgiveness, The Fourfold Path for Healing Ourselves and the World, Tutu wrote this: we are not responsible for what breaks us, but we can be responsible for what puts us back together again. Naming the hurt is how we begin to repair our broken parts. Naming the hurt. Now, friends, as we think back to this story that we've had alive here with the children, I imagine that Joseph got very little sleep from the time that his long-lost brothers appeared on his doorstep. When his famished family alights on his doorstep seeking food desperately, he is legitimately floored. He had fully assimilated into Egyptian culture and learned how to move on with his life. But I imagine that the pain catches him up. We hear the emotion as lived through his body, his mind, his spirit. All those painful moments and years of tears come flooding back. And Joseph has to truly find out what kind of man he is now and what kind of men his brothers have become. Is he the kind of person who does unto his brothers as they have done unto him? Now, I have to say that we might feel at points that this testing that Joseph does of his brothers, which must have happened over the course of many, many months because of all the travel that was involved back and forth to get the brother to go back to get the father, especially framing Benjamin with that silver cup in his knapsack, feels harsh. For Benjamin is innocent and wasn't a part of that original crime. Why doesn't Joseph yell and gnash and show them the anger that he has reserved for expression behind closed doors? Instead, he tests to see what kind of men they have become. If he has changed so much since he was a youth, have they done so too? Joseph starts to believe what he will say to them, which we heard today. God sent me before you to preserve life. And that is what Joseph is able to do. It is with Judah's words, the same brother who orchestrated his persecution to the pit and to the slave traders, the voice that came through Mary Jane this morning. Judah is the very one who comes and volunteers to be taken as a slave and servant in place of his youngest brother. Herein, Joseph sees that the favored brother is no longer vilified. Just as he had been the favored brother and was vilified, now he sees that Benjamin can stay in a place of favor. And even with the surreal circumstances of this surprise reunion, we find that the work of forgiveness is not a magical switch. By seeing Joseph live through the hardship, none of it comes easily, and it therefore feels very real to us. As does Simon's reaction to Carl that day. There in the field hospital, the soldier had the opportunity to voice his pain, trying to take responsibility for what he had done. And it is in writing the story later, with all of the emotions that Simon would go through, that he is given the pathway for confronting his own pain. All those years of enslavement that he faced, unlike Joseph, he was not in a place of power when confronted with an enemy. Simon returns silently back to his mop and clears out waste. The soldier inflicts upon Simon an impossible responsibility, and Simon chooses to take the story and use it as a dialogue and a pathway to naming his own pain. He will work and he will heal on his own terms in time. Simon will, for his own sake and for the sake of the millions, I believe, that have encountered this story since, following this world since, have sought to understand the limitations of our own human capacity to heal with brokenness. Friends, we hear Tutu's words. We can be responsible for what puts us back together again. This is what Joseph and Simon have in common. They take ownership and responsibility of their own stories, and when given the space that they need, address their own healing. We might ask where God is in all of this, not referenced so very much through this story. But we recall that Joseph has said, God sent me before you to preserve life. Simon preserved life for bringing Carl to life on the page of his book. We cannot ignore a humanity that we would otherwise like to dismiss. And for those of us in the habit of believing in the divine image of us all, we still see a child of God. Friends, this is a heavy story, both of them. It comes to us probably conjuring our own deep-seated places in which our relationships have snapped, been severed, or still yet need healing. But we come to this communion table today because there is room enough for all of our tears and all of our emotions, an invitation that goes out to each and to everyone. Because we find that even in our own knapsacks that we carry, we find that what at first is a cup of resentment has a chance to become a cup of blessing. And what was the grain is a serving, preserving force of life that Joseph extends to his brothers, is extended with great joy unto us. For we are always hungry and always in need of God's grace. And we believe that in confronting the challenging relationships that we hold, all of our suffering still leaves room for hope and new life. As we look out here today, there are no doubt persons facing trying aspects of your connections with family and friends. And I hate to say it, but maybe there's resentment right here in this very room, and an opportunity that as we come into a space of healing, to meet God here. Here we are given the opportunity to mourn what is no more and adopt a new lease on life through the forgiveness and love of Christ, the one who bore violence and pain and death and brought forth resurrection. So our sunflowers here today are a sign of that resurrection that comes to meet us in the place of wherever our pain might be. 2 years ago at Easter, we had sunflowers here, remembering those who in Ukraine were facing violence each and every day. That continues. We look out to places like Sudan and to Gaza, and we know that the pain continues. But we also know that in the integrity of life, we pray that there would be the plantings and the flowers that bring new hope unto every heart. And so it is with that remembrance that we will have a few moments of silence to be in touch with the places of your own desire to forgive and your own places of pain, that you can name them in your heart, that we can share together in prayer, and that we can come to this table of grace. We do so with outstretched hands, anticipating that we still might have it all figured out, but that God in time meets us in our stories, is able to handle all of our emotion and brings us to the other side to a place of new life. After we receive communion today, you'll have an opportunity to take a sunflower as a sign of that resurrection and hope, and a symbol of God's ongoing forgiving power and presence with you.